purpose of this video is going to show you how the Supreme Court can impact sort of like the balance of power between the national government and the states. Most of American history has been like a battle between the national or federal government and the state governments to see who should be exercising more power. And oftentimes the Supreme Court has the ability to weigh in on who's going to win that fight for power. So right now, this is the current Supreme Court, and we've already talked about the differences politically between liberals and conservatives. And right now, there are 6 conservatives on the Supreme Court. They're in red, and 3 liberals. So there are 6 people that are of conservative ideology that tend to favor state and local officials maybe having more power, and 3 liberals that tend to support maybe more involved like federal or national government. So again, the makeup of the court can go a long way in determining like which side is going to win that balance of power. All right, so early on in our country's history, one of the first chief justices, he wasn't the first, but within the beginning of our country's history, was John Marshall. And John Marshall was chief justice early on and really kind of like set the tone for at least an early advantage for like the national government and like an initial attempt to allow the national government to expand its power. So like most of the Marshall Court's decisions early on in our country's history favored like a stronger national government. Cases we have already talked about, like Marbury versus Madison, which gave part of the national government, the judicial branch, the ability to declare laws unconstitutional. Like Marbury versus Madison established judicial review. McCullough versus Maryland was that case that we talked about involving a national bank. And even though the word bank wasn't listed in the Constitution, could the national government get away with it? And the answer was yes, because it linked it up to something that was in the Constitution, which is a commerce. So again, setting the precedent that you could do more than what was listed in the Constitution, as long as you linked it up to something that was. And it's really interesting to look at sort of like Marshall's background. He decades earlier was an aide to General Washington at Valley Forge. And if you remember Valley Forge, the Continental Army was unable to be like fed and clothed properly, like literally soldiers freezing to death. And that really showed Marshall the dangers of a weak national government. So like that was a very formative time in his life. We saw what happened when the national government was weak. And no surprise, when he's Chief Justice, most of his decisions tend to benefit a stronger national government. But then, if you look at like throughout history, there are like famous cases that are examples of the Supreme Court either sort of like favoring the national government or taking power away from the states. Like, so for example, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, takes power away from the states, says like, you can't segregate anymore. We're not going to leave it up to you. And sort of like forced all of the states to integrate public education. Or much more recently, in 2012, the Supreme Court decided in Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius that the Affordable Care Act, which was one of like Obama's like big accomplishments while he was president, was legal. And this was essentially a law that required people to have health insurance, otherwise they'd have to pay a tax as like a penalty. And people sued, saying like this isn't a power the national government has. But the Supreme Court disagreed, allowed Obamacare to go into place, right? Real name of the law is the Affordable Care Act, and that like expanded the power of the federal government and allowed them to get involved with something that they previously hadn't. So you have one example of a case that takes power away from the states, and one example of a case that sort of like just gives additional power to the national government. But then there are also examples of Supreme Court decisions throughout our country's history that either benefited the state governments and gave them more power, or sort of took power away from the national government. Famous one back in the 1800s was the Dred Scott v. Sanford case in 1857. This was a Supreme Court decision, amongst other things, that basically decided that the Missouri Compromise line that was drawn in 1820, that the federal government basically said, if you are a territory and you want to come in above this green line, you have to come in as a free state. If you are a territory that exists below the green line, you have to come in as a slave state. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not determine slave status for a particular state and essentially invalidated, erased that Missouri Compromise line, giving that power back to the state governments. In 1995, a more recent case, the federal government passed the Gun-Free School Zone Act that made it unlawful to basically possess a firearm within a certain distance around a school. There was an 18-year-old senior in San Antonio High School, San Antonio, Texas, at a high school in 1995 that brought a gun on a campus and was arrested and prosecuted under the Gun-Free School Zone Act. His lawyers made the argument that there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the federal government the ability to pass a Gun-Free School Zone Act. The federal government's argument was that, like they've done before, they're going to link it up to something that was in the document. So their argument was like the ability to control commerce is in the Constitution. And their argument was the better the educational system, the better the economy, and the less violence in an educational system or in a school area, the better the educational system and the better the commerce. And like that was like their link. And the Supreme Court, in one of the few circumstances of American history, basically smacked the hand of the federal government and said, no, like that's too much of a stretch. And they basically declared the Gun Free School Zone Act unconstitutional. And it's one of those rare times that the Supreme Court doesn't allow the federal government to do something that's not listed in the Constitution by linking it up to something that is, right? And then the last one is the most recent in 2006. The state of Oregon passed the Death with Dignity Act. This allowed patients that were given like terminally ill diagnoses. They were told by their doctors no chance of recovery. That in order to sort of avoid that pain and suffering that they're being told is coming at the end of their life, that this law actually allowed them to solicit the help of a doctor, and a doctor could help end their life early, assisted suicide, euthanasia, before they went through that pain and suffering. The federal government tried to intervene, prevent doctors from being able to use drugs to do that. And essentially the Supreme Court said that states had this right to give to patients if they wanted to, and told sort of the federal government to butt out. So these are examples of Supreme Court decisions that either took power away from the national government or gave additional powers to the states.